Hello everyone, so this is part 2 of my story of my involvement in the development of the RS100 dinghy. If you haven't seen part 1, or if you haven't got a clue what an RS100 dinghy is, I'll put one of those links on the screen, here somewhere, for you to go back and have a look, because I'm not sure I wouldn't say here, because it'll make much more sense if you've already seen part 1. So if you've seen part 1, you'll know that we've already now defined what the boat is that we want to build, and we've decided what we want from it. Now the trick is to kind of work out all the little detail bits that are going to make that boat happen. And the first one, which is quite obvious, was the whole racks stroke shape of the boat. I decided quite early on that it needed to have some means of getting the crew weight further out from the centre of the boat. I didn't want it just like a laser where you sat on the side. The benefit to be gained from having racks or being able to get your weight further out was key to me in making this a nice boat to sail. That said, as much as I liked the racks on the idea, one thing we'd learnt from the development boat was that racks, when you're trying to fly a spinnaker and all the extra string and controls you've got, don't actually work that well. You want to be able to just slide your body weight from inside the boat where you start off with, or when you're hoisting the spinnaker, or where you are in the lulls when you're sailing, and then just slide out without actually having to use your arms or hands to move, which kind of ruled racks out. We then spent some time looking at making a sliding wing type affair, like the laser EPS had, for those of you that know what a laser EPS was. The idea was they were quite nice, comfortable shaped wings on the laser EPS that they could slide in and out, and they used that as part of their weight equalisation system. Now, at the time we were doing this, there was a friend at the club who had a laser EPS, so I borrowed it for a few weeks. I have to say there's a lot going for it. It's very comfortable. Not sure the equalisation system as a whole works. Not sure it ever works. But there's a lot going for it. So Paul spent some time sketching models out that used wings like this. And we went quite a long way down this route, and we liked the look of where we got. But you have to ask yourself, why don't laser make the EPS anymore? And there were a lot of reasons for it, but one of them was, and especially having spoken to previous owners and stuff, the wings always gave problems. If they didn't leak, they'd jam, they'd come loose, lots of problems with them. So really that wasn't a route we wanted to go down. So that really only left us with a flared hull shape. But I didn't want something that just looked like a big wide flat dish. But Paul had already put a lot of effort into making these sliding wings aesthetically pleasing on this boat, so we decided, why don't we make the sliding wing fixed and part of the deck moulding? So that's the way we went. As it turned out, I think it looked great. You see, one of the kind of indefinable points that I wanted for this boat was, as I've already mentioned, I didn't necessarily need it to be fast, but I did want it to feel fast. But I also wanted it to look fast. People should have, there's a pleasure in just owning nice things. And I wanted this boat to have that look of something that was refined and nice, and that people would just have take pleasure in just owning. One of the downsides to the Vario, the boat that RS currently made, which had a spinnaker, is a very slab-sided functional boat, and I don't want to do it a disservice, but it doesn't look exciting. You line it up against a Musto skiff and it's very obvious which one the racing boat is and which one's the club racer type, Toyota play boat. I wanted this boat to line up alongside the Musto skiff and look just as purposeful. Anyway, so moving on, and looks are still part of what I'm going to talk about next. The next thing to talk about was how we're going to handle the spinnaker. as we discussed last week, a spinnaker bag, obvious I know, or obvious to people that understand these things, wasn't going to work on a single-handed spinnaker boat, which meant we needed to have a sock. Now, I'd had it in my head from the beginning, we'd have a sock like a 29er has. Hannah and I had 29ers for a long time, and we know what it's like. The idea is you have a metal hoop at the bow of the boat to act as a chute and a feed for the spinnaker when it comes in and out, and then just a canvas or material type sock that attaches to this loop and feeds the spinnaker and keeps it under control as it comes back in the boat. It's really nice and simple, and means that the whole deck hull joint can be kept nice and smooth and purposeful looking. It's the same thing again that's on a Musto skiff. It's lightweight, looks sleek, looks good. When Paul had originally drawn the first drawings of the model for the RS100, he used the boat, the RS Cuba, which is an adult rotor-moulded version of a laser. Which seems a bit of a strange boat really, given the direction it would take, but we're only interested of course at this point in hull shape and hull form, and that was the closest we had. And part of the RS Cuba had a foredeck on it, and that just stayed there. And then in the same way that I had it in my head that we weren't having a deck over the top, we would just use a chute, Paul had it in his head that we would have a foredeck. So we got in this situation where he wanted to go one direction and I wanted to go the other. And I didn't really have any real concerns against the deck moulding, other than I wanted the boat to look good. And I was, I suppose, nervous that we'd end up with something like an RS Fever and an RS Cuba, where it's like a plastic tunnel on top of the boat, and that it would just look cheap and wouldn't look sleek. And Paul, in the way he was trying to convince me that, no, this is a route worth pursuing, said, well, look, it doesn't have to be made out of anything, it could be made out of carbon. And then that suddenly got my attention, because we'd already decided, very early on, we decided this had to have a carbon mast. Again, this was a modern boat, built for the time. We didn't want it unduly heavy, we wanted using modern materials as far as making something cost effective would go. So having a carbon foredeck would just look really pimp, and at the time there weren't boats like that, and we thought, Paul obviously was already convinced, but he convinced me. So from that point on, the whole carbon foredeck with the spinnaker chute built into it was an integral part of the design. So once we'd got some of this detail down, the real time was put in by Paul in arriving at a shape that sort of ticked all the boxes. Now we knew how the decks were going to sit, we wanted to make sure that the helm could sit on the inside edge of the deck when he's pulling the spinnaker up and down, but still be in the wetted part of the hull, so it wasn't unduly tippy. One of the problems I have with the RS100 I've got now is that there's nowhere to sit. You have to sit right in the middle of the boat, so you're on the wetted area. If you sit on the wing, you're so far away from the wetted area, the boat just falls over. And of course, trying to make this a practical spinnaker boat for your average club racer to sail, having that stability while they're in the boat, probably not got their hands on the tiller and the main sheet while they're pulling the spinnaker up, having that stability was important. So there was a lot of time spent by Paul in optimising the hull shape to keep it as slippery as possible, but still keep the stability we needed in the boat for the crew. We also wanted the cockpit to be reasonably deep, so that you didn't feel like you were perched on top of it, and that you had a degree of sitting in it. Again, for comfort, as I said last week, although it wasn't a kind of, again, a written requirement of the boat, Paul and I were both adamant that if we were building a boat from scratch, we shouldn't design in some of the things that make current boats and current designs uncomfortable. We should put some effort into making it comfortable. That actually did come with one drawback, which we didn't really notice until the boats were made, but I'll come back to that later. So by now, we're quite a long way down the path of designing this boat. We're almost at the point of having to build it. Then quite coincidentally, Paul had an interview with RS. At the time, the next step was going to be to have effectively a giant foam block machined in the shape of the hull. Paul and I would have then skimmed it in a couple of layers of glass fibre, stuck a rig on it and gone sailing and see what it was like. That would only ever be a prototype, but it would be a prototype and it would work, and there's many a good boat been designed and built that way. But before we'd spent any money, Paul had an interview with RS. Coincidentally, he was talking about something to do with the RS Fever or Terror or something like that, the boats that they were already selling for him. And in the conversation, like you do when you make small talk with people, RS asked him what projects Paul had been working on. And of course, one of the things that came up was the boat we'd been doing. So Paul said, well, I've got a client and we're designing a single-handed boat. And RS sort of said to him, well, that's strange, because we're thinking of the next project, the next boat we want to make, and the single-hand is what we want to do. And of course, Paul's saying, well, yeah, it's great, but I doubt it'd be like this, because this one's got a spinnaker, and you've already got the Varia. And they said, well, no, actually, we are thinking of a spinnaker boat. And of course Paul said, well, yeah, but we're not having a trapeze, this is just a plain simple hiking boat. And they said, no, that's what we want, a simple hiking boat, you know, along the lines of the Vario, but more racy. So after this meeting, Paul came back to me and said, you know, what is it I wanted out of this? Up until now, I hadn't paid him any money. This had all been a very gentleman's agreement. Paul could see the benefit of the project we were working on, could see the potential, and knew that I was, you know, I would take it to the point of building a boat, so we'd go somewhere. So he was doing it on trust as well, because don't forget, this is how Paul makes his living. I'm doing it for the fun of it. Paul's got to make a living out of this. So he came to me and basically said, look, do I tell RS? From his point of view, obviously once we made the prototype, he would be wanting to look for a builder to take the project forward. So to have someone on board now, you know, had benefits. And at the end of the day, when you look at people that could build the sort of boat we wanted to make in the volumes that we wanted to make it, there aren't actually that many companies, certainly not in the UK, 3 or 4 that you'd even want to approach. And when you look at the ability to market a new project, RS really are, you know, leagues ahead of everyone else. So there seems a lot of sense in it. Of course, at the end of the day, I was only in it for the boat. I just wanted to design the boat. So I said, Paul, it's fine. You talk to RS about it and see where they want to go. Anyway, long and the short of the story is, Paul spoke to RS. RS loved it, and it was exactly the boat they had in mind, and they wanted to take the project on. And to be honest, I wasn't going to stand in the way. RS were going to make a much better job of building a prototype and building boats than Paul and I were going to do in our, you know, shall we call it, amateur way. So it seemed like a good thing. Of course, in hindsight, there were decisions made as we went along the development path that I wouldn't necessarily have done, and which led to a boat that wasn't quite the boat that I had in mind. But that's not to take anything away from RS. RS did a fantastic job. There's so many decisions you have to make in designing a boat, and compromises that have to be considered. You could always build the same boat 10 different ways with 10 different people in it. So, and the boat they came up with, they've sold hundreds of them. It's clearly a success. So anyway, RS came on board, and the first thing they did was get a quarter scale model made of the hull. Just so you can, because looking at it on a screen, you don't get the same sense of proportion and the same sense of how the lines flow as you do when you look at a real boat. So they had this quarter scale plug made, and it was fantastic. Really showed off the lines and showed off the work that you know, Paul and I put into arriving at a shape that we felt would work, and really looked good. And RS were impressed as well. So following that, they then went on to, rather than just make the kind of one-off prototype boat that Paul and I were going to do, they had so much faith in the project, and you know, they'd obviously had so much confidence in Paul's ability to design a good hull. They liked the look of what they got. They jumped straight into making a lightweight mould. Not the sort of mould you want to build hundreds of production boats from, but certainly a sort of mould you could build half a dozen prototypes from and then tweak if you wanted to change anything. So that's what they did. They built the mould, they built 2 hulls. So by the start of June, they actually had 2 boats in the water. And Paul and I were invited down to have a sail in them right from the beginning. Now, there was a few decisions made in that time that I wasn't part of, but some I agree and some I didn't agree. One was they closed off the transom. All the models up until now had an open transom to let the water just flood out, because that's the trendy way to make a self-draining boat. Paul and I were already aware of the fact that the leverage you could get from the flared wings, with the extra forces that would go through the boat with the spinnaker up and so forth, that the hull might be too flexible with just an open transom. RS agreed with that and decided to close it in. There's obviously some extra build complication in that you have to consider, but RS know how to build boats and they weren't at all concerned about the effect that might have. Another decision that wasn't ideal but could be understood, there's a lip seam that goes around all the way around the hull that joins the deck to the hull. It's the way modern dinghies are made, and to be honest, is the only sensible, cost-effective way of making a large number of dinghies. If I'd been making the one-off I was doing, I would have had a nice smooth join between the deck and the hull to keep it looking sleek. But I could fully understand why RS went down that route. The last thing that I wasn't so keen on, but this was RS project now, it wasn't mine, was they put an unstayed rig in it. I call it unstayed, but as we discussed in the first part of this film, we'd long since learnt that you need stays on a boat with a spinnaker. The forces on the mast, when the spinnaker's up, bend the mast in a completely different shape than you want, or the mast would normally have, and you need the stays to support that. But what RS did was they used effectively an unstayed mast. They, of course, had the RS100, which everyone loved, which had, of course, had a plain carbon mast with a lot of bend in it, and they liked the gust response and the effect of that mast sail combination. So they used that type of mast, but with some stays. So when you're sailing upwind, the stays are essentially loose and not really affecting the response and the set of the sail. But downwind, when the spinnaker's up, the stays are there just to hold the mast in check so that it doesn't bend forward or change shape. I would have much rather had a stayed mast. If you see my film on the RS100, one of the things I don't like about unstayed masts is the fact that all the gust response and the tunability that comes with a mast is completely in the hands of the person who built the mast. There's nothing you can do with a rig to change the way that mast and sail are going to set. With a stayed rig, you have effectively a lighter weight mast and use the spreaders and the shrouds to hold that all in check, and that means by changing the tension in the rig, by changing the angle of the spreaders, the length of the spreaders, you can affect the way the mast bends and the response that comes from it. I would have much rather gone down that route, but as I said, this was RS's project now, not mine. Anyway, the first boats we sailed said a lot of things. One was the rig and sail were going to take a lot of sorting out. Now, they weren't messing around. They had Ben McGrain, who was working for Selden at the time, who's a very well respected sailor and knows his masts, and they had Mike Lennon, who was working for Hydes at the time, both of which now are doing other things, but again knows his sails. They had those developing the equipment. The one problem is, of course, that the two go hand in hand, so you can't really develop a sail until you've got the mast defined, and you can't really define the mast until you know how much load the sail's putting on it. So the fact that in these first prototypes the two didn't really work very well together wasn't really a surprise, and equally wasn't really a problem. It's part of the whole development process. The reason there was two boats is the other thing that RS had done in the meantime that I wasn't so keen on, but understood, is that they decided to handle different crew weights, they'd have different size rigs. I would have much rather have had one rig and then have adjustable racks or adjustable beam to suit different crews. My idea at the time, which actually was Paul's idea that we developed together, was use wing extensions a bit like the ISO did have. Those of you that remember the ISO, which was a boat from the early 90s, one of the very first kind of big manufacturer asymmetrics, was it had plug-in wing extensions on the side, so that lightweights carried these extra bits on the wings that let them sit further out, but these wings were made heavy so that would add some weight. So you didn't, it wasn't all wind. You had to accept, do you have a lighter boat with less leverage, or do you have the leverage and accept the penalty of the weight? And I thought that was a brilliantly simple way of equalising different boats, but keeping one rig, and then everyone races together. The trouble, as soon as you introduce different rigs, you end up in a situation like the laser and the laser radial is, where they're effectively two different classes on one hull. Anyway, RS wanted to go down the multiple sail route. I can understand that. It's just two different ways of skinning the same cat, as the old saying goes. So we sailed them both, and they were great. The only comment that Paul and I both made at the time was the sails were really big. We had it in our head all along that we would have been in the between 7.8 and 8.8 square meters of sail, something like that. That's what, as I think I said in the first series again, I did a spreadsheet calculating what I thought the right proportions for this boat would be, and that was the number I came up with. And as it happened, Paul had his own spreadsheet for crunching numbers and arriving at proportions of boats, and basically came up with the same idea as I did. So when RS came up with something that was basically 8 meters and 10 meters, that seemed big, and they also put a very big spinnaker on it as well. But again, this wasn't my project anymore. This was RS's, and RS knew their market and they knew what they were trying to achieve with it. So I wasn't going to complain. The thing with the spinnaker though that's relevant is that right at the beginning, like I said, I wanted to target this as effectively a single-handed version of the RS100. And one of the beauties of the RS100 is that it doesn't have that much sail area, so that the spinnaker's not too big, the sails aren't too big, so you can sail it on many different angles. You know, you can tight reach with the spinnaker in the right conditions. Whereas if you're building a boat just to go fast, you effectively carry as big a spinnaker as you can, because that means when you go downwind, you can sail deeper angles and you get faster VMG and you go quicker. So that's the trendy fast boat way of doing things, and was really the sort of along the lines of thinking of what RS were doing. They certainly didn't go as big as they could have gone much bigger, but it's certainly bigger than the spinnaker that Paul and I would have put on it. Anyway, those were the first two boats. They then went on to refine the rigs. They tweaked one of the hulls to flare it slightly to help promote the planing ability, which worked. We then went through a series of, they went through a series of a period where they invite interested people that had expressed an interest in maybe buying an RS100, because they were keeping the market up to date on what was going on. They'd started a kind of a blog on the yachting press to explain the progress, and invited a lot of people to come along to have a sail in the prototypes and give some feedback on the direction it would take, so that hopefully they'd build boats that people wanted. Again, I was involved in that. Basically spent my time pushing people off the beach and driving a rescue boat around all day. But it went really well. RS got some good feedback. I had some good times. It was good. It was still good to be involved in the project. And of course I get to have another sail and stuff. Anyway, so this went on, and then by October, basically they had the design complete. Again, RS invited Paul and I down to just help. You know, we were now one of the many interested parties in the boat, but to give our opinion and to sign off on the design as it was. And I think Paul and I were both really impressed with the job RS had done. The boats are brilliant. They're beautifully built. They look just the part. They really do look sleek and efficient. They were everything we were trying to achieve. Again, the only comment Paul and I made was too much sail, but it was a small point. The sails now set well, they were good. It was just more than we would have put on the boat. And that's kind of it. The one downside I think I mentioned earlier, which was about the wings that I hadn't mentioned, and that came from use with the boat later, was that when it was on its side, because these wings now are quite large, because they're designed to be comfortable, and the boat really is comfortable. Anyone who's sailed an RS100 will tell you they're about as comfortable as a hiking boat could ever get. But it means they're quite fat, which means they're quite buoyant, which means when the boat's on its side, and it's quite benign on its side, it doesn't particularly cause any problems. It sails, it floats quite nicely, but it floats very high. It's very difficult to get on the centreboard if you're in the water. And then once it comes up right, although it's fairly stable, it's not so easy to climb in the back, because now we've got a transom and stuff. But it's all doable. It's just, in hindsight, I wish we'd given a little bit more consideration to making the wings flood so that they didn't, so the boat floated much lower in the water, and it would make the whole capsize drill much less traumatic. But that's it. That is how I got involved in the RS100. I got a boat out of it. Well, I had to pay for it, but I only paid cost for it. RS effectively weren't really beholden to me at all. This was a deal I had with Paul, and I'd effectively given Paul rights to yeah, it was how he made his living. I was just happy the boat was built, so I'm grateful for RS for keeping me involved and giving me the chance. I bought the boat, I sailed it for quite a while. The only reason I sold it is two things. One is one I was aware of, and one I wasn't quite as aware of, although I think I knew but didn't give as much credence to as I should have. The first one is, and I've gone on about it already, there's too much sail. For my weight and ability and size and fitness, the 8.4 metre, which was the smaller of the then two sails, was still quite a big sail, and it was hard work. And then the second reason is, and one that's kind of obvious in a way when you think about it, but I didn't give as much emphasis on when I was thinking about it, is that now you've got an asymmetric spinnaker. Asymmetric spinnakers, you can't go deep, you have to sail angles, and if you're going to sail angles efficiently, it means you've got to hike hard downwind just as you would hike hard going upwind. So now you don't get a rest. In the laser, they're very physical boats upwind, but downwind, I mean, it can still be physical downwind if it's windy and you're playing with waves, but generally speaking, you're sitting in the boat and you get, if not a rest, you get to use different muscles. In an RS100, on any kind of breeze, you have to hike hard upwind and then you have to hike hard back downwind. It's very physical, and I didn't give that the consideration I should have done. But the boat is still awesome. I'm glad I was allowed to keep in touch and play my part in it, and it is almost the boat I wanted it to be. I am still tempted to buy an RS100 and put a rig on it, what I'd consider a proper rig on it, so a bit less sail, maybe make some extensions for the wings, and put a stayed rig on it so I've got some control. But yeah, in a way it would turn it into something it's not. It is what it is now, and it's great. It's great for it. So anyway, that's my story of my involvement in the RS100. The bits you don't read on Wikipedia and on the RS website. So thanks for watching. I'm Ian. This is Sailing with the Foxwell family. Next week, hopefully, we'll be on the big boat, and if this COVID-19 pandemic's calmed down, we might even be sailing it back. Who knows? Thanks for watching.